yeah, kicked off this week's newsletter with a piece on Musiala, and I mean, I felt a bit bad kind of looking back on the Ballon d'Or fiasco from last week because I do try to look forward when it comes to these things, but it felt quite pertinent for this international week.
It did. That article on Jamal Musiala, I thought was really interesting. I read that first thing in the morning when I got up, and my opinion on the Ballon d'Or. I think it has been a joke for quite some time. I'm old enough to remember players getting that award based on merit and not on popularity, which is what it descended to during the Cristiano Ronaldo, Lionel Messi era, right? It basically became a popularity contest between those two. I'm old enough to remember players like George Weah winning it, or Matthias Sammer, a libero, a defender from Borussia Dortmund, back on the basis of winning the Euros with Germany, right? Or Fabio Cannavaro before the whole Messi, Cristiano Ronaldo era kicked off. I feel at this stage, I don't know. The last little bit of credibility that it lost to me is when Frank Ribéry was overlooked, or Manuel Neuer. But here we are. There was quite a lot of outrage over Jamal Musiala. My opinion is that, and I think you kind of pointed that out, I think the explanation in the article that you gave from Garcia, I had to really laugh about that one, and you can maybe go into that one as well. But at the end of the day, I don't think Jamal Musiala would have won the Ballon d'Or this year anyways, and I don't think he would have deserved to win the Ballon d'Or based on the performances he had last year. But you put it so eloquently in your article that I want to give you the floor here first before we dive into this.
It's nice to say. Yeah, of course. Look, he was never going to win the Ballon d'Or, so it was a kind of, it's not really something that I think is hugely important. I said it's obviously not Bayern Munich's biggest concern. It's not Musiala's biggest concern, but I do kind of think the Ballon d'Or does have a kind of unique place at Bayern Munich because it's one of the few things in football, and the only other things maybe quite literally the Champions League itself, that can draw a distinction between Bayern and the best teams in Europe at any given period of time. Obviously, right now that's Real Madrid, and I just think whenever the Ballon d'Or comes around, there's the tedious discussion about, well, why should we be giving out individual awards for a team sport, which I more or less agree with, to be perfectly honest with you. I think there's politics involved. I think it's probably closer to Eurovision than a genuine, meritocracy, if you will, in terms of, people vote for their friends. Every year they kind of release because I think it's every national team manager and every national team captain gets a vote, and they get released, and, outside of like the top kind of 20 nations, you've then got people who just pick Messi or pick Ronaldo because they've been their favorite players for the last 15 years, for example. So it's a pretty flawed kind of system, to be perfectly honest with you. But at the end of the day, it's something that footballers like. It's something that the very top footballers crave. And I think you can kind of go through Bayern Munich's history and see how it has turned players' attention. I seriously don't think if it wasn't for the Ballon d'Or, I don't think Lewandowski pushes for a move to Barcelona the way that he has done and the way that he eventually did, for example, because he felt he didn't get the recognition playing for Bayern that he maybe would have done at Barcelona or Real Madrid. You could probably make the same argument for Toni Kroos before that, even though his was probably more a case of Bayern maybe not showing him enough love. And I just wonder if it's something that might play into the Jamal Musiala situation at Bayern Munich. There's been a lot of discussion this week from, the usual Christoph Freund and Max Abel about Musiala's contract, how it expires in the next year or two. And I'm not sitting here trying to suggest that, Musiala's going to push him for a move away because he didn't get nominated for the Ballon d'Or this year. I honestly don't think he's probably expected to be nominated. I don't think he's really that frustrated with the idea of not getting recognition for what was a very average season. And first and foremost, that's up to him as well to improve on that. But I just think the kind of double-edged sword of Bayern Munich wanting to be the best club in Europe means that when they do have some of the best players in Europe, they have to keep up their end of the bargain, which is pushing for that final spot in the Champions League every year. And it just feels like every so often a superstar comes along at Bayern, and they make that abundantly clear. As I said, it was Toni Kroos before, it was Robert Lewandowski. I'm sure, Manu, you could probably think of a few others along through the years.
Well, even going as far back as Lothar Matthäus, right, who won the Ballon d'Or playing in Inter Milan.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And as I said at the end of my articles, players, at the end of the day, the very best players don't really move for the best wages. They move for glory. They move for success. It's why Jude Bellingham plays, as I said, it's why Jude Bellingham and Kylian Mbappe play in Madrid and not Saudi Arabia. And that's something that Real Madrid can absolutely bank on. And it's something that they can quite literally trade on in the transfer market by saying to these players, we can't pay as much as Manchester City, we can't pay as much as Manchester United or Chelsea, but we can promise you, a shot at the Champions League every year, and as an extension, get your name in the Ballon d'Or shortlist. I mean, I don't think that's as important, I suppose, but so anyway, it just kind of came back. It's just something that kind of popped into my head as I kind of watched Musiala kind of tear Hungary apart. And I guess, consequently, how he didn't tear the Netherlands apart tonight. And I just think it also maybe just means it's a very interesting point for Bayern as they look to kind of get back on their feet and rebuild themselves as a super club, but also an interesting point for Jamal Musiala, where I wouldn't so much say there's no question marks being asked of him, but it's now up to him to prove that he can be a player that can get back into that conversation about Ballon d'Ors by becoming this match winner for Bayern Munich. And it's almost like a symbiotic relationship, really, where Bayern need Musiala to be world class, but Musiala also needs Bayern Munich to be world class. And if one of them doesn't live up to that, then it's a relationship that I think will be pulled apart.
Well, also, I think if Musiala wants to play at the club level with Florian Wirtz, that's not going to happen at Bayern. Let me throw that grenade into the room. But, I do think, and this is something that I really thought about after I read your article. You know my opinion on Jamal Musiala. I'm an original card-carrying member of the Jamal Musiala fan club. I loved the guy from the first moment I saw him play. And I remember making the trip to Munich to see him play during the pandemic, and was really disappointed when he was out injured, right, during that time. And when I did finally got to see him live, I was blown away, and I'm still blown away every time I get to see him live in stadium. I think the experience seeing him live, it's one of those players where you don't really fully appreciate it until you saw him live. It's just the little things he does on the ball and off the ball are just so incredible and it's not always a center of attention. But I think you make a really, really important point here in a lot of ways, that Jamal Musiala hasn't really come up with these great moments. He had that one when Bayern Munich clawed away the title from Borussia Dortmund, right? That was one of those occasions where he stepped up in a really important moment for the club and won them the title. But I do think he played a fantastic Euros. And if Germany maybe beat Spain and move on and win the tournament, which I think they would have if they had beaten Spain. I went into that game against Spain and said the winner will win the tournament. And I was proven ultimately right? And I think that if Germany had won that game against Spain, they would have moved on and won the tournament. They didn't. So he finished the tournament with 3 goals in 5 games, including a really important goal against Denmark, right? We don't want to put that aside. That moment did happen, and he also scored a really important goal against Hungary. So those moments were important, but he didn't score against Spain. That was Florian Wirtz, wasn't it? And I think the one comparable that we often see here, right, when it comes to Jamal Musiala, is Thomas Müller, isn't it? And Thomas Müller, and you see the Bayern people do this already all the time. They mention Thomas Müller or mention Jamal Musiala as the natural Thomas Müller successor. And I think they're right. I think if Jamal Musiala signs that new contract, you know, he will get paid all the money in the world by Bayern Munich. I think money here isn't the issue, as you already pointed out. Ultimately, what always made Thomas Müller this really important player for both club and country is he scored in those important moments, right? And I think this is also, I think, really important to point out. Thomas Müller was a little bit of a late bloomer, wasn't he? He really burst into the scene when he was, 20, 21, and then immediately jumped in the national team and won the Golden Boot at the World Cup and all that kind of stuff. It happened very fast. Once he did burst into the scene, it all happened very fast, right? But that is, I think, something that we're still missing a little bit from Jamal Musiala is these really big moments, these big moment goals. And I do think they're going to come. I think they are going to come because he is that special of a player. And I think it has to happen soon because, I made this point, and this is maybe a nice transition to what let's talk about the Netherlands game first, because it's fresh. Today would have been one of those times for him to maybe step up and win the game for Germany. I think ultimately those two countries were quite happy with the 2-2 draw, Stefan, because the new format means that the top two nations in the group advance and the other two countries in that group are Bosnia and Hungary. And I think we can pretty much safely assume that Germany and the Netherlands will finish first and second. But maybe we would have liked to see a little bit more from Jamal today to just kind of nicely underline the point that you made in the article.
Yeah, and that's why I said a moment ago that, it's quite pertinent to these two games because I think, and I completely agree with you, the Thomas Müller comparisons can be useful, but they can also be quite damaging for him because, as you said, Thomas Müller has defined himself at Bayern Munich as the player who steps up in the big games. He's also the player that clubs just cannot find a way to stop. He's the He's the interpreter of space. He's the guy who kind of drifts through defenses like a ghost. And in a way, if you think about it, he's the complete opposite of Musiala, because Musiala is all about his technique. He's all about his skill. Every time he gets the ball, he does something that draws the attention. He's far more like Messi or Kaká or whoever else from previous generation, if you will. And he's a player who already demands, 2 or 3 markers on him, whereas even to this day, people don't take Thomas Müller seriously on the football pitch. They think, just the way he comes across, his body language, the way he runs across the pitch. He's not a player that takes other defenders on, so there's never a case of, another defender having to come over and cover in case he runs past them. Very different types of players, but also just in terms of that reputation, Müller, as you said, didn't start off as this kind of wonder kid who the world was excited to see. He's a player who had to overcome adversity. He's a player who had to wait for his time to shine, and only really happened through, Louis van Gaal or previous coaches who were able to kind of get the best out of him.
And one wanted to sell him to Hoffenheim.
Yeah, well, exactly. So very, very different from Jamal Musiala, and I think in a way, that also kind of underlines the frustration that Musiala has, and I think these two games are a good example of that, where against a very poor Hungary team, and I don't say that just to kind of undermine Germany's success. I say that because obviously I watched them quite a lot this Euros because they played Germany and Scotland, and I still maintain to this day that even Scotland should have beaten them at the Euros. Musiala had a lot of fun. It was an easy evening, and he looked like a world-class player. But we then fast forward to the Netherlands game, where they have much better players. They've got far more physical midfield and defence, and they have the capacity to kind of almost man-mark Musiala throughout the match. And it was a deeply frustrating game for him. There was actually a moment where he kind of gets shoved off the ball and he's looking for a foul. And I think it's Florian Wirtz who has to basically run past him to cover for him. And you can see Wirtz kind of tapping him in the back, being like, "Hey, come on, stop complaining, let's get on with it." And even when
Yeah.
it came off, I think Nagelsmann had a word with him, and you could see he was just muttering, saying, "It just wasn't my day." But unfortunately, I think that's something that Bayern Munich fans have had to get used to over the last kind of 6 or 8 months, where, as I say in my article, he did score a single goal or assist in both games against Leverkusen, did get a goal or assist in both games against Borussia Dortmund in the Bundesliga, and only one assist in the knockout rounds of the Champions League last season. And I think a lot of that's down to simply how much he'd been overplayed in the 2 seasons before that, and the fact that he was probably really jaded. But that's also just the kind of nature of modern football now. That's the nature of all these players. All these players that he's up against in the Ballon d'Or or the World Cup or the Euros or whatever else are also playing that amount of game time. And it's all well and good to, I think I noted that he scored or assisted in 10 league games last season. So not to say he scored 10 league goals or assists. He got, I think, 16 in the end. But he did that in 10 league games, and a lot of them were against lower league or lower opposition. I think Leipzig's maybe the only top four side that he got a goal or assist against last season. So it's things like this that I think he's definitely going to have to work on this season. It seems a bit unfair, a player that young and a player who's already done so much for Bayern. And I'm sure Bayern Munich fans will be saying, "Look, we've got a lot of problems, but Musiala is not even in the top 10 of them right now." So I completely understand that, but he wants to be the best player in the world. And if you want to be the best player in the world, you have to do it against the best. And unfortunately, as Lewandowski showed before him, you can score 30, 35, 40 goals a season, and you can even do it in their Klassiker, and you can even do it against Leverkusen, and you can even do it in the Champions League. But if you don't do it in the games that win those tournaments, there'll still be those kind of lingering questions from people elsewhere in Europe, and that's a glass ceiling that Musiala is going to have to smash. And I think last season he struggled to do that.